open government we have Sydney. Yeah. Any closing opposition we have On the motion, this House, as the Chinese Communist Party, would allow fair and competitive elections for local government officials, such as mayors and local councillors, and invite the Prime Minister to open the case and call the House. Oh, sorry.
Speakers, do you consent with being live streamed or recorded? Because otherwise I can. Okay. Oh yeah.
Rearranging my notes.
Building suspense.
As the Chinese Communist Party, what we care about is maintaining power, particularly maintaining power via an autocratic form of capitalism with Chinese values. The way that we think that we might lose power is through revolution, is through people campaigning on the streets to get rid of us. What we therefore want and need to do is prevent revolution from happening. The problems that the Chinese Communist Party currently we face, is that there is no pressure valve. If people dislike us, we do not know in what ways they dislike us. By doing this, we can therefore, by allowing elections, we can find out what it is that people's grievances are. Furthermore, the biggest our popularity is the failure of our economic policies. By allowing local elections, we can allow for local forms of liberalization in ways that do not harm us at the top, but can prevent economic collapse. 3 points in this speech, therefore. 1, a characterization of the problem and how it is that the to be able to remove us. Secondly, why it is we need a pressure valve to work out what it is that the people want. And thirdly, how it is that we can solve some of China's current economic problems in this way. So, what are exactly these problems? First of all, the population is very educated. They know what's going on. We're also very well connected to the internet. We cannot easily block this. It means that they have large information flows. It means that state propaganda is not as effective as once it was. Secondly, because of this internet, they can organize. They can get together and decide to start campaigning on the street. No, thank you. And the third thing is that they have shown that they are willing to do this. Tiananmen Square was a failure on the part of the Communist Party to contain dissent, because once it gets onto the streets, suddenly the legitimacy of the regime is damaged. So, how is it that we solve this? First of all, the pressure valve. What exactly is the problem at the moment? Because the problem with all autocratic systems, particularly those with large bureaucracies, is we don't really know what the people think. There are large numbers of those at the top and the ordinary people. In particular, people might have some sort of a say with their local officials senior to national, and then national to the leaders of the entire country. What are the problems when you have all of these different layers? First of all, communication flows are difficult between those groups. Those who get ahead through each of those steps, one, self-select as really liking the leaders of the party. Secondly, are other selected by those above them as really liking the current practices of the party. Thirdly, even if they aren't selected in that way, they've been in the party for a really long time and so tend to be socialized within the values of those at the top of the party in a moment. And fourthly, to the extent we ever do ask locals what they think, laws on sedition and subterfuge mean that people are generally unwilling to talk openly. Yes?
So, you tell us at the start
the problem you want to evolve is people campaigning on the streets to get rid of you. What exactly do you think a local election looks like other than people campaigning on the streets to get rid of the people who are in power?
So what they're doing is trying to get rid of some of the local officials. Obviously, these are only local elections and not national elections. We can still try and contain certain forms of dissent against people at the very top. So how is it in particular? Oh, also, furthermore, the people who are campaigning in things like Tiananmen Square are those trying to overthrow the entire system of government, the entire regime. When you see people campaigning on the streets in elections within the West, they're not trying to get rid of liberal democracy. They're just trying to get rid of particular individuals within that structure. No, thank you. So how is it that we solve the particular problem of the pressure valve? Now we can know what it is that people think in a more credible way. If they elect local officials who say that they care relatively more about air pollution than they do about the success of their local coal station, it means the Chinese Communist Party knows how to balance that. At the moment, when it comes to the problem of terrible air pollution, we literally have no idea what it is that's going to create more anger. Is it controlling air pollution or is it controlling economic growth? Here it is, we can stop things like Tiananmen Square from happening because now we can gradually adjust our policies in reaction to those information flows before it reaches the streets, before we have a propaganda disaster which spreads throughout the country, and before we have an international propaganda disaster. So now onto the next problem, which is that of economic growth. Because the Chinese Communist Party at the moment derives a lot of its legitimacy from the fact that it can provide lots of economic growth. The thing which started to dampen down much of the dissent of the late 80s and early 90s was starting to hit growth rates of 6 and 7%. People seeing real and meaningful change in their lives. This means that we as a party adjusted much of our rhetoric at that point to say that what it is that communism can provide is precisely that economic growth, and moved away from the older rhetoric of things like proletarian revolution, dictatorship of the proletariat, or exploitation. What does this mean? It means that we need to maintain that economic growth in order to preserve our power. The most likely way that the people rise up is when the economy tanks. Under what conditions do we think that might happen at the moment? 1. Local officials are currently running up huge amounts of debt. This is something which we're finding very difficult to control because local officials have a lot of power, mainly because there are a lot of them, and it means that they need to be appeased. They start running up large amounts of debt, which actually means that China's position nationally is one now almost of being a debtor and not a creditor. If suddenly the people who are lending to China take fright, a crash because the government will no longer be able to continue funding its spending. If we now move responsibility for local spending to local officials who are democratically elected, those who are just being stupid with the budgets will get elected out. They will have to take responsibility for that debt, and they're going to have to start raising taxes if they want to pay it off. Either the people then allow that, which gives it more legitimacy and stops local anger, or alternatively, they then bring down the spending. Secondly, it brings down local corruption. This is one of the things that locals really, really hate. Now it is they can remove those who are more corrupt. More of this corruption happens at a local level. We can solve that particular problem. But thirdly, there is also a certain need to liberalize. So things like China's steel industry at the moment is loss-making. But we at the top find it very difficult to reform that because local officials have got a really, really strong interest in those local steel mills. That's why we can't change it. If, however, so we assume, however, that those who might get elected are likely to be slightly more liberal than those who are in the local official positions. Because how is it you could be more to the left of the local Communist Party official? At that point, we can then at the top be more of a Zhu Enlai and less of a Mao because we start removing the people who are blocking the biggest threats to our economy, namely the inability to liberalize. Because we provide this pressure valve, because we protect economic growth, we propose.
Bourgeois was able to seriously threaten the stability of China and the Chinese Communist Party merely through a system of internal dissent based on neo-Maoism. What opening government proposed is to take that dissent outside the party, to intensify it and to remove all controls we have on it. China has had a unique 30 years of stability, but previous to that, there had been 200 years of humiliation, poverty, and civil war. We think this policy, which destroys the role of the Chinese Communist Party, destabilizes our grip on China, threatens a return to that national nightmare, and an end to the Chinese dream. 2 points in this speech. Firstly, how the Chinese Communist Party is currently maintaining its power, and secondly, why this policy is uniquely well designed to loosen that grip on power and drive instability. Before that, responses to what Tommy told us. So Tommy tells us that, in essence, the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power is currently threatened due to the internet, and therefore we need to liberalize to subvert this threat. It's worth noting the example he gives us of the internet causing unrest in China is 1989, which was successfully crushed 30 years ago, and there has not been any significant dissent since then. By comparison, other regimes in Europe which were communist chose to pursue the liberalizing policies which opening government followed, and no one's heard of the East German, the Russian, or the Ukrainian communist parties since. Frankly, the Chinese Communist Party's stance of pursuing continued control rather than reform has worked as after Tiananmen Square, whilst the policies pursued failed dramatically for communist parties in Eastern Europe. Secondly, he tells us that state propaganda has become less effective. We think that's a case for ramping up the state propaganda machine in ways like Xi Jinping is currently doing by, for instance, recruiting nationalist rap groups to support his cause. Cutting down the propaganda machine by allowing free elections is the worst way to entrench party support in that way. Secondly, he says more organisation because the internet. Firstly, example Tiananmen Square, which suggests there's not more organisation currently taking place. Secondly, no, we control the internet of China currently. We have strong censorship laws, and there's also very high degrees of support, on it, and there's an increasing crackdown on the uses of VPNs to access foreign material, and increasing control of Weibo or other Chinese networks. So we don't have dissent spreading in this way. Thirdly, the assertion that we don't know what the Chinese people are doing. Genuinely, we think there is a very high degree of support for the Chinese Communist Party based on its continuing deliverance of a good economic result. But to the extent there isn't, there are alternative, less drastic means of measuring that discontent than allowing ourselves to be voted out of office. For instance, there are internal party elections in which different members of the Communist Party with different visions of how capitalism with Chinese characteristics can develop. And we think that's much less drastic than placing it outside the party and surrendering our control. But moreover, Chinese social media, while censored, usually allows some degree of sensible dissent. For instance, you cannot criticise the control of the Communist Party, you can criticise its particular running of environmental policy in one area, and the anti-corruption campaign currently being run is similarly very responsive on that. We think, therefore, we have effective mechanisms to counter dissent. Finally, on the economy. So the first thing to note, they essentially tell us the economy is too decentralised, and therefore local officials are able to run up debt or pursue unliberal policies, making it less centralised by ending one-party rule. Having less concentration of power in the party Politburo seems a bad way of coping with a policy of too much decentralization. But secondly, the assumption there are more liberals being elected seems fundamentally flawed at the moment, where the most dynamic political movement in China at the moment is neo-Maoism, which would probably be electing the majority of these new people. Finally, we think that it's more likely that elected officials have an incentive to run up debt. Why? Because they're being assessed by people in the local area who presumably you're not going to let these local areas go bankrupt, or else you have massive hits to your economy generally, and therefore they've got no incentive to be responsible. So, firstly, what are the underlying claims of the Chinese Communist Party to China? We would assert there are three underlying principles which secure its legitimacy. Firstly, it sees itself as a nationalist saviour which saved the Chinese people from 200 years of Western humiliation. Secondly, it sees itself as essentially a technocratic force with unique expertise, in running the economy. Finally, it brands itself on the credibility of its leaders, people who've risen up through running individual cities to join the Politburo or the Politburo Standing Committee, and they're explicitly branded in that way. Why do we think this is uniquely well defined in order to destroy the credibility and therefore the basis of support of that party? Firstly, we think city governments have a large degree of prominence. We think that's specifically because of the Chinese system in which the officials gain their legitimacy from the fact they've risen up via city government posts where they build up power, build up a reputation, and therefore they rise. So the legitimacy of leaders is connected with their running of large metropolitan areas where they have much influence. Closing.
The CCP will still have control of the entire Politburo, and by your own analysis have a very high degree of support, which suggests they're going to win elections and gain further legitimacy. How is that destabilising the CCP rule?
Firstly, you've just knifed opening government in a POI, whereby they'd suggested there was a risk of revolution, and your case now appears to be premised on the fact that there's continued stability. Secondly, we would say the fact there is currently a reasonably high degree of stability is no reason to throw it away by putting in a mechanism which creates a greater chance of damaging instability. Secondly, how are people likely to use these podium? Necessarily, these people are running against the Chinese Communist Party. They therefore need to brand themselves in opposition to it, differentiate themselves from it, or they're not going to win. They need to portray themselves as better at growth than the Chinese Communist Party, better at anti-corruption than the Chinese Communist Party, better at being a good Chinese nationalist than the Chinese Communist Party. Secondly, they're likely to seek to expand their power and expand their influence. Why is that? Because politicians desire influence. That's necessarily got to be at the expense of Communist Party officials, because that's where they are those who currently have the power. What does this look like? At best, this looks like a Navalny, i.e. a relatively tame centre of opposition. At worst, this looks like a Yeltsin, someone who will centralise power in a region and destabilise the regime. Who is likely to be elected? It's either people who brand themselves as anti the Communist Party on grounds of corruption, or alternatively, it's radicals of various descriptions. It's neo-Maoists who seek a return to a more collectivist economic policy. It's nationalists who seek a confrontation with Taiwan or Japan. Or alternatively, it's regional nationalists who want greater autonomy or even to split up the Chinese state and therefore to destroy the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Two final effects this has. Firstly, it damages the confidence of those in the Communist Party. They're no longer prepared to sacrifice it, no longer prepared to live for it, and to build their career around it when they see there being alternative mechanisms and more of a possibility of avenues whereby others could build up a basis from which to oppose the Communist Party. Secondly, it builds up expectations. If there is some degree of uncensored media, some degree of free elections, as in Hong Kong, it becomes incredibly hard to crack down on that later because there becomes a norm built up around it which is very difficult to erode. China is currently reasonably stable. We think this motion creates a mechanism for destabilization in the medium term by giving people positions of prominence from which to oppose the Communist Party, destroying the Chinese dream potentially. Very proud to oppose.
Are you ready? Rafi stands up and says there's large support for the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping in particular. We say, yes, there is. That's why you're not going to see, even if in a couple of elections you get people turning to local neo-Maoism, it won't happen on a large scale which seriously destabilizes the party. What we do say it allows is people who still support the Communist Party but have local policy preferences about getting rid of a couple of dodgy officials that they don't like. That gives Xi Jinping a way to start reforming the economy. Because what we said from the very beginning of Tommy's speech is that the only way that that large support is going to erode is if there is a huge economic crisis which brings down the government, which leads to Arab Spring-style uprisings, which brought down what previously seemed like very strong autocratic regimes in the Middle East. What we think Xi Jinping should do is follow the example of Lee Kuan Yew, who liberalized the economy, made a very powerful place in Singapore, and he was able to do that because it was small and local, and reinforce their power to stop a large crisis. And note, we think a crisis is very possible. Just because the Chinese depreciated their exchange rate too quickly, global markets tanked by 20% because they feel the Chinese economy is so unstable. There are large amounts of debt, shadow debt, within state-owned companies and within local governments, and large amounts of inefficient industries which they need to reform. First, some responses to opening opposition. Rafi says, oh, this didn't work in Russia, therefore it probably didn't work there. Firstly, it would have been nice to have some response to Tommy's actual analysis. But secondly, we think Russia is a very different situation because it was literally a communist country. China is not a communist country. It is effectively a state capitalist country where they can just liberalize industries somewhat more. Because Russia was so much further from that, the people felt the only option was a dramatic transition to capitalism or remaining with communism. That's why it changed very rapidly. He said, unrest can be shut down on Weibo. We think that once, as long as people are like very well connected on things like Weixin, the like chat app that everyone has, and Weibo, that if the economy was to tank, that would mean that people could mobilize quickly. They're all in large concentrated urban centers, which means they could launch large protests very quickly. And given that lots of them are very poor, lots of them are living hand to mouth, if there was a crisis and the Chinese state-owned firms had to rapidly reduce employment in failing industries due to a crisis of government debt, we think that could lead to a sudden large increase in unemployment amongst the very most needy, the most bitter, those who might rise up. Rafi says people will vote for neo-Maoism. One, we think that's a small subset of the population. Most of them have seen that the liberalizing forces in China has led to a huge amount of growth, and they'd probably be willing to do that. We see Xi Jinping's corruption drive getting huge popularity. We think those are the sorts of things people would focus in on the local level. But even to the extent that they do get a few neo-Maoist people elected on the local level, good, because we think neo-Maoists are probably going to screw up that local economy a really great deal. So when everyone sees that neo-Maoism really isn't the way you're going to get more jobs for your kids, we think that's really good because it further empowers Xi Jinping to make the liberalizing reforms, which are the only way that he's going to stabilize his country. Finally, they gave a broad point on legitimacy. One, we think there are lots of other ways. As I think closing government fairly point out, people can rise through, we think they'll still win lots of the elections since there's large support and large amounts of popularity. There'll still be people rising through there. There'll still be people rising through the army. And we think this is an incredibly long-term point. It would only happen 30 years out. We are focused on the much more pressing issue of whether China can get through a difficult economic transition over the next 5 years. So, firstly, I'm going to show why Xi Jinping is functionally unable to enact these reforms despite the centralization of his power. But first, Rafi.
Why do internal Communist Party elections not offer a better basis for reformist Chinese Communist parties?
Because, how do you decide how they work, right? Because they'd be very... Because they're very corrupt, the patronage networks in the Communist Party means, one, you can sort of buy people out of local elections. I think the way these positions are done is they're sort of elected by a local committee, but we think that committee can just choose the candidates which are going to reinforce those interests. Presumably, they're going to have some list system which selects Communist Party members, which in turn will be faced by those same issues of patronage. Furthermore, I'm going to explain some things structurally that Xi Jinping won't want to do. Okay, so one of them is the Communist Party doesn't want to be seen to be making liberalizing reforms like shutting down steel mills, because that might be unpopular. And if it goes wrong and it led to lots of discontent, that would be very risky. Therefore, communist officials might not be willing to talk about it. Tommy also talked about the socialization of Communist Party officials. More right-wing people, we're hoping for mini Thatchers growing up on the ground to propose some liberalization. Second of all, the reason why Xi Jinping can't do some of these reforms is because local members who are tied in directly affect his power base. Why? Because they are involved in selection procedures for the Politburo, which ultimately decide whether he will be replaced or not. Furthermore, the patronage networks mean that lots of local members are integrated into the army and integrated into the higher echelons of the Communist Party, which could remove him at any point. And note they never challenged our characterization that all the Chinese Communist Party cares about is effectively maintaining control over the economy, whether it be in a Lee Kuan Yew sort of way or in a slightly more communist way, as they are doing now. So, now I'm going to talk about what these local elections look like. Because what they said was that Xi Jinping is the most popular leader, probably since Deng Xiaoping, or even more popular. We see his face all over China. There is literally a pub in the UK, which he went to once with David Cameron, which has now been turned into a shrine. It's no longer a pub, which Chinese people visit when on holiday in the UK, because they love Xi Jinping that much. This has been driven by his successful anti-corruption drive and so on. So what do we think? We don't think there's going to be a huge amount of get rid of the Communist Party, people marching on the streets. How do we think? And anyway, look at what these people can campaign on. Local party governments can't change things, policies about things like Twitter or whatever, like liberalization, and like broader democracy. They don't have influence on that. They only have influence over the local economy. So we think that's the things that they're going to make progress on. And we think to the extent that they do advocate policies which are different to the Chinese Communist Party, that's good, because Xi Jinping can then say, these are policies, bear in mind, that he probably wants to do, as I've explained, because it was like cement his power and reduce the risk of revolution, but he just can't do due to power structures and the risk that it'll be bad if anything goes wrong in the liberalization or some people are hurt, that he'll be blamed from it from a working class support base. What he can now do is pass off liberalizing policies as me bargaining with the opposition, me making concessions to them so that even if they do go wrong, it's still their fault, but also look at how I'm willing to do what the people want and build more support and build consensus. We think that'll reinforce him, that'll lead to more love for him, but also mean that he can get through the policies which will stop the one real risk that he loses complete power, that is a popular uprising by the working class as if a major economic crisis hits China in the next few years. I'm so proud to propose.
I thank the Speaker for a kind speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue his last
Panel, I think the thing this government fails to understand is just how astronomical, irreversible, and disproportionate to whatever problems of legitimacy and whatever economic problems China faces at the moment this policy does. As Rafi told you, in order to do this, you would need to completely upheave the current systems of media within that country. You would have to completely change censorship laws. You would have to completely change the internal structures of that party. That was a risk we in opposition were never willing to take. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on the survival of the Chinese Communist Party, and secondly, how policy becomes a lot harder to implement, and in the long run, that feeds into problems, for instance, the economic issues. Firstly, on the survival of the CCP. I'm going to take a timeline approach here, talking through the process this government needs to go through in order to provide free and fair elections. The first thing to say here is they produce immense precarity in order to produce the conditions. They have to do things like lease up on censorship, because even if the people they don't want to win, or the people that would then legitimise the CCP who wins, you still have to let them talk. They have to do things like produce more varied media coverage, let more people into that conversation. They have to do things like create the parties and structures and organisations that are going to oppose us in the future. So if opening government just wants to get rid of a few dodgy officials, we think anti-corruption is a lot safer as an alternative to creating the very institutions that could destroy us. The risk of revolution, while it might be pretty small at the moment and pretty bad if it were to happen, is made so much worse when you literally have the institutions that are going to build that dissent, when you literally have the leaders that are going to head up that revolution. No. The second thing to ask ourselves is, who is going to win the election and where? We think, as Rafi told you, they're going to come from ideologies that oppose the CCP, that question the foundations of our country, that are going to come from regionalist groups, they're going to come from neo-Maoists in rural areas, or from hyper-liberal people in cities. And, as opening government says, this isn't just a question of screwing up and then proving something wrong. This is questioning the premise of the way that a technocratic China works. In a centralised system, it brings the country together compared to these divergent opinions. We think that sows the seeds for long-term internal disputes that will be unable for this government to resolve. So to conclude this question, we think you're likely to see some people elected who are going to be questioning the very premises of our country and what brings us together. But secondly, those that aren't are going to be sowing seeds of doubt. The third thing to question in this debate is, what is the effect on internal CCP politics? And that's something that the opening government, aside from saying, well, for some reason, internal elections don't work because you self-select, for instance, through systems of patronage. We think that's a broadly simplistic characterisation of the way the CCP works. We think there's a balance of interests between wanting best governance, wanting a continuation of that party and the ideology, perhaps having some mild preferences for people who share similar ideologies, but broadly also wanting to be responsive and wanting to make sure that the needs of the people are met so that you don't see the revolution this government says. What happens under government? The first thing to say is you destabilise that party from the very bottom when local authorities and local officials are worried about losing their positions. But secondly, you lose potential talent that could be going into that CCP in 10 or 20 years' time because they're going to alternative measures. What do we compare this to? No. We tell you we're on a trajectory towards gradual liberalisation, increasing responsiveness to public concerns and internal competition. It is true that the last few years has been a blip and there's been increased dissidence. We don't think that is a long-term trend when you look at the last 30 years of stability we bring you. No. The takeaway here is that the fact that this policy is very difficult to undo at the point at which you built the institutions could destroy you means that at the moment we are running a very minimal risk of dissidence at the point that no, most Chinese people accept that the mistakes made by the CCP are done with well intentions and they're likely to correct it. At the point that you can respond with things like concessions, or at the point which you can unify that country with a narrative of wanting the best for everyone. By contrast, government runs the risk of permanently undoing every bit of progress that it's been made, creating thousands of problems in the future. Before I go on, Emma.
What do democratic movements look like when they resist the concept of the CCP as existing at all, rather than competing with the CCP to prove they can be economically better?
I mean, they do both. We think to the extent they're likely to say they have better economic policies, they're also questioning the foundations of that CCP. Compared to internally, where they accept those premises and move from there, that is something that is unifying to one of the most diverse countries, where you literally have like over 1 billion people from incredibly diverse regions that think very different things about the future of that country. So, why does the central policy of the CCP, why is it harder to implement? The first thing to say here is that we think local governments can implement contradictory policy at a local level. Government wanted to claim this as a benefit, saying that you could not close the steel mills if people didn't like it. It was very confused when they kind of said that something people didn't like would be done in an electoral system, even if it was better for the entire country. We think that worsens the debt issues of opening government when, for instance, local officials that are not from the Communist Party can do so with impunity, without punishment, because they have received whatever legitimacy closing government wants to give them. So the second thing to say here, is we think you get less popular support for the Communist Party policy in the face of criticism. And that is just to say that your local official is not just talking about the steel mill or how food is allocated within that region. The neo-Maoist police chief is also criticising the central policy, for instance, an anti-corruption campaign. And that sows the seeds of doubt nationwide and creates a dialogue that isn't just about that region. Toby.
At the point where people are well connected through social media, many have VPNs to access the internet and can see the success of democracy in the West, what particular extra symbolic change does this bring?
We think to the extent that some wealthy people in cities have media, that is true under either side. You massively expand that at the point that you have to create local papers. Presumably, you have to create papers in poor rural areas in order to make those elections in any way fair. Like, the matter of scale here, but also, you didn't respond to any of our other material on doing things like building parties. The third thing to say on this point is we think you lose credibility to international actors. For instance, a business considering investing in ways that make that economic growth so much harder to sustain. And that was something opening government told you was crucial to the success of that party and the success of China. The reason why this is the case is because Beijing can no longer make guarantees on certain economic conditions. So when Chase is considering setting up shop in Chengdu, it's a lot riskier for investment if they don't know what particular local regulations they're going to be having to deal with. Panel, this policy is irreversible. It sets up the institutions that are going to destroy the CCP and destroys every bit of progress that we've built internally, every bit of progress we've made in that party becoming more responsive and better. So very proud to oppose.
Here's the thing. We accept the revelatory premise that the Chinese government has a lot of support in many areas in China. But it would be truly insane to think that in a context of increasing economic dissatisfaction and the failure of the CCP to deliver the same kind of boom in economic benefits, a push for more democratisation that is being actively resisted by that government, that the technocratic state as it exists on their version of the state can continue to exist. What does that mean? We present a version where the CCP controls what democratisation looks like by doing it at a point that it's powerful and not where it's weak, and by making democratisation compete on its metrics and not being able to remove the state as a whole. That is a better version for people, for the CCP, and it makes all of those things look better. I'm going to do two things in this speech. First, explain why it shapes what democratisation or any resistance to the state looks like and why that's better for the CCP and the continuation of the state. Second, explain how it makes the vision of the CCP better into the future and evolves that party into a better version of itself. I'm going to integrate rebuttal at the start of those points and throughout. So to the first point, I'm going to deal with a lot of what in particular Sophie brought here, which is how it builds up a norm of liberalisation, and that's bad. A couple of things. First, we analogize this directly to the kind of restrictive liberalisation on economic grounds that they're talking about in terms of getting more competition and allowing those kinds of increasing policies. It's unclear why they think that there is not the same demand that would push for those things that would make people dissatisfied to a large extent, that would create resistance, when there is for those kinds of economic policies. We think they should get the benefits of things like competition. Second, yes, censorship you will have to remove to some extent. We believe the CCP has gotten fairly good at selective censorship, for instance, allowing people to have a lot of information that allows them to be satisfied with the context they have, but not information that would otherwise undermine the CCP. We think restricting that no thank you to information about local government elections should be fairly easy, but also allows them to have access to an open discussion of those ideas, where there is also a large presence of CCP ideas, as opposed to any kind of discussion of those things happening in underground and illegal channels, which means there is none of that context. And if you want any resistant information to the state, you get it in a context devoid of any influence of that state, no thank you, or of what the CCP thinks. Extra substantive material here about how this allows the CCP to control what resistance looks like. First, we say there are a couple of cases. If the CCP has a lot of control over the entire external media landscape and what the other policies look like and the external economic conditions that influence how well local officials can do, this is a good time to institute its control and makes it more likely the kinds of CCP officials they're talking about will still be elected in these conditions. If it does not have that control, it is on the precipice of being overthrown in many of those areas by the kinds of groups they're talking about. So you need to offer a constrained version that channels the majority of people who are dissatisfied with the CCP but still want some version of that state into their arms rather than the arms of the only legitimate democratic resistance. Secondly, substantively, what does this make resistance people do? First, as I just mentioned, it removes the power of a majority of dissatisfied people being forced to go into supporting those kinds of resistance. But also secondly, as they mentioned, there are a lot of marginal communities or geographical areas in China, including things like Muslim minorities or particular areas, no thank you, that are ill-treated, that have the perception of the state as not dealing with them, that is significantly reduced if they at least perceive that their local government is responsive to them, and that makes them think the CCP overall is more likely to be responsive. No thank you. Secondly, you force them to compete on economic measures which the CCP has an enormous advantage over due to its capacity to influence national policies and its historical legacy at being able to implement those. That means you can't just offer a vision, no thank you, of a state that is not the CCP without providing it to the people of that area, which makes the CCP have an advantage over resistance groups that will continue to exist. And yes, they will continue to exist to some degree, but for most people, if they're disproved as not being functional, then that means that people won't support them. That's better. Third, you bring the kinds of people who are currently resisting the CCP, if that's who you're worried about, into continual cooperation and work with CCP officials and with the CCP regime. Because in order to deliver effective results for their local area, they need to cooperate with the national regime. They need to build relationships within that regime that makes them more functional. We think those kinds of relationships are what ensures the CCP has long-term control and influence in the areas, particularly the areas they're least likely to retain control control over into the long term. No, thank you. Lastly, we just think it is good for the CCP and for the democratic conceptions to have to prove themselves and to say why there is a value in democracy, because otherwise the CCP screws itself by making democracy this mysterious concept that could deliver enormous benefits. And in many areas, if it will fail, we think that that's a good thing for the way you conceive of democracy into the future. I'm going to move to my second issue now, which is how we conceive of the state. Closing.
So, do you think it is likely that, for example, Bo Xilai might stand as the mayor of Beijing on a platform of you shouldn't elect this local party official because he was complicit in the regime that murdered thousands of people when they protested here? Why would it be only economic issues that they constrain?
Those kinds of resistances happen in a way that is not elections and the CCP doesn't compete with. They get large popular resistance from anyone who wants to resist them. What we say, and this is the next point of my substantive, is this removes the worst elements of the CCP in a way the CCP does and should want. Because increasing inequality and the entrenchment of historical legacies in local government where there isn't the scrutiny of the main CCP regime entrenches the worst versions of it that make it harder for the CCP to retain its control. We think adaptation of that movement that is forced by being forced to compete with what is the best version of politics in your local area makes the CCP more responsive and able to have policies that change. It also means you have local units that can deliver more specified policies that the CCP national regime can't see itself as doing, is treating areas significantly differently in a way that otherwise would lose them support. Secondly, this gives people the perception they can influence the government even if that is not true, because it makes you think like you have some connection to that regime that makes you less likely to be dissatisfied, especially if you're the majority of people that are getting a lot of the economic benefits they talk about and able to recognize the benefits of stability. It also means you blame your local officials, whether or not they're CCP, as distinct from the national CCP regime, so you're more likely to continue supporting that even if you get dissatisfactory local policies, which happens no matter who you elect. Thirdly, this has a declining ability on the ability to rely on there's a declining ability to rely on economic claims that the CCP needs to address. There's an increasing middle class that means you can't deliver the same economic benefits and increasing inequality. What that means is you have to control the vision of democracy and wrap it into economic claims and put it in a vision where the rest of the country is still controlled, to say that democracy is not a threat and that you can have those other kinds of failures that says that democracy can be enrolled into the CCP that tamps down other resistance that would happen. Some resistance will happen. The best version of that resistance looks like wrapping it into the CCP party that otherwise has dominant control to prevent it becoming a real threat to the CCP. That is best for the CCP.
I'd like to speak for Brian Speech and call on the member of opposition to continue the outside.
Relying on democratic liberalism as our source of legitimacy will destroy us. We should therefore rely on increasing economic prosperity. It has been most successful for us as the CCP before, and this will significantly harm that economic prosperity. Crucially, regardless of whether opposition candidates win, this will cause increasing dissent, lower economic growth, and foreign capture. This characterization that opposition candidates will only compete on economic metrics is simply ridiculous. First of all, free and fair elections proposes that you have free and fair access to information. This includes the massacre of individuals in West China. This includes Tiananmen Square that I think opposition candidates will capture and oppose them on. It is not in the CCP interest to make to incite protests, strikes, and separatism and destroy China as a country. This is regardless of whether liberalism will happen. It simply cannot and should not happen now. One, there is an increasing incoming trade war with America, which will be a short-run economic hit to China. China needs to win this trade war with the US. If we do this now, all the opposition will distract from winning that trade war. The cycle of dissent will spiral, consuming resources and time from us being able to win that trade war. We run the risk of democratizing to some degree, inciting separatist movements in the West, including people in Tibet, or especially the Uyghurs, or anyone who isn't Han Chinese will stand in separatism to China and destroy the country through minority ethnicities and separatism, arguing that lower down officials should oppose the government and inciting the kinds of protests that lead to minor civil war with the Chinese army. Second reason, the significant rising popular nationalism, especially in the East, driven by Chinese militarism, has already incited attacks on Japanese businesses and minor riots. Now opposition, especially in East China, will attack the CCP for not being nationalist enough. First of all, this means the CCP has to move in order to protect itself from this right-wing flank and will have to respond. This is things like China, in order to demonstrate its sufficient nationalism, doing things like provoking Japan, encroaching in the South China Sea. This looks like China doing something that will provoke a war in East Asia, that will kill hundreds of people, but furthermore significantly destabilize China and lead to the downfall of the CCP. 3, the party conference is coming up. It is in 6 months. This will flow dissent into proxies from Xi Jinping's opponents. These include Liao Shengshun and Zi Qilang, who has criticized China for being too weak on Japan. This will be used by his opponents to direct and fund opposition, causing immense political infighting publicly and destroying CCP credibility, which will crucially happen when opposition candidates flow money into their proxies at lower levels in order to criticize Xi Jinping. We think this will destroy this will ruin the chances of the CCP of being able to control China going forward, and crucially one of the significant reasons as to why this cannot happen now and will significantly destabilize the CCP's ability to control China. This will shatter our economic prosperity. One, we think the Communist Party will struggle to continue to micromanage at the lower level, which has driven enormous economic prosperity and has been one of the reasons why the CCP has been so popular. Micromanagement has worked. Things like the internal passport and migration control has significantly incentivized individuals to move to the city, which has driven growth through cheap labor in cities, making millions of individuals much more richer than they once were, and making the CCP massively popular. Despite the fact that individuals have had to move, their life quality has increased immensely, and the CCP's popularity has grown because of that, improving our interests and making our lives as a CCP better. Second of all, this means there is significantly less requirement for welfare in the rural hinterland, so actually your life in the rural hinterland is much better because you're providing for a much lower population far away from infrastructure. Second of all, the CCP has been able to completely replan the countryside for infrastructure and move communities in order to benefit the entire country. The Three Gorges Dam displaced hundreds, but also provides over 50% of electricity for the bordering provinces, which was something that the CCP was able to plan because it didn't have constant intransience from opposition candidates at the lower level constantly saying we should not build this dam because it's in my backyard, whereas it would have provided 50%, where it would have significantly increased the standard of living for millions and increased the popularity of the CCP. Strikes and protests are bad for business. We are less able to buy, sell, and make goods, lowering the standard of living of Chinese people across the country and making them much more likely that they will oppose the Chinese Communist Party. Second of all, this is incredibly vulnerable to foreign interference and will increase the likelihood of instability and unrest. This becomes increasingly difficult to control as opposition candidates are able to do things like organize because of the massive platform that elections provide them, and able to attract massive, for instance, like rallies in the streets, or able to attract the kind of media attention that would only happen with elections. Whereas under the status quo, activists are essentially useless, which is one of the reasons why they're not popular, whereas elections give them the massive platform I already laid out. What free and fair elections, as I said, leads to later greater Chinese access to information, for instance on Tiananmen Square, which is largely not even known about, which will lead to dramatic increases in political capital for opposition and intense criticism and shame for the CCP, which is obviously against our interests. Second of all, Western activists will fund untrained activism. Under the status quo, it's near impossible to get a foothold as a foreign actor because of the ease of the CCP purges. But foreign governments and foreign actors have a huge incentive to do so because of the potential access to money and information and the potential to destabilize a country that is the rival of many countries all around the world. But now they will smuggle money and provide training to the kind of opposition candidates that they have laid out. This also leads to ideological capture of Chinese young people who come to Europe and America to study for university, and their skills will no longer work to benefit China or the Chinese Communist Party. This leads to more protests and, if the worst case scenario, active sabotage. Does closing have anything to add?
Yeah, those kind of groups you talk about funded by the US, the only ones who can resist the state machinery you say is so strong. Why should those be the only option for people who are increasingly economically dissatisfied with the CCP?
So firstly, we think the vast majority of opposition candidates will include that information because obviously it is the most emotionally charged information to provide to Chinese voters. It is not the case, and if it is the case that you think that the Chinese Communist Party will prevent them from ever making this kind of opposition arguments, that is not free and fair elections, because if I am an opposition candidate and criticize Xi Jinping and you arrest me, that is not a legitimate opposition candidate. Second of all, we think even in cases where there is some economic arguments, we think that is largely mixed in with things like, with things like we should oppose the Han Chinese dominance and we should become a separate country. So obviously those arguments become mixed in together, and we have had no explanation as to why it is mutually exclusive that one candidate will only be about identity politics or the fact that perhaps the Chinese army should stop shooting us, and then another candidate will only care about economic issues, which is obviously not the case. Obviously not the case. The total control of the Chinese Communist Party has been immensely successful in protecting China from the kinds of foreign intervention that has destabilized elections in the United States, in Russia, and in Western Europe, right? Whereas the Chinese Communist Party is able to protect from that kind of interference because of its complete control and its ability to purge those who have worked with foreign governments. It is obviously against our interest to include foreign governments' access to our secret information and our money and our citizens, and we should prevent that at all costs. Oppose this really stupid idea.
I thank the Speaker for a fine speech. I call upon the government to vote for the
Good. Panel, if there are burgeoning hyper-nationalist movements in the East, strikes in many of the countries, plenty of upcoming conflicts that might anger and cause citizens to revolt, and foreign powers wishing to interfere, what better way to make those interferences toothless than to force them to compete in local mayoral and councillor elections in small city provinces? Because much of that analysis, whilst derived from the fantastic Economist subscription of Closing Opposition, ignores that these are mayoral races and not elections for the presidency, and that when you force people to compete against the Communist Party that has enormous economic claim and legitimacy, that has enormous local history, that has had control of the media in that environment for 50 years, you can defeat those in the best way and undermine their credibility in a way that side never can. The most under-analysed part of that closing extension is what on earth will you guys do about them? What on earth will happen when the only thing they can do is revolt? No, thank you. When they can engage in worse activities. That's the first thing I'm going to look on this speech. What did they say in extension? The next thing is to ask, what do these elections and movements look like under side closing government? And then thirdly, what is the impact on the government? What did we hear? There's large hyper-nationalist movements that are going to win. If that's true, and those undercurrents exist under your side, they will also exist because their popularity is not tied at the moment to whether or not you can vote for them. Because if they exist now, there are no elections, which suggests that they're fairly widespread. We would say then that if those things exist, the best way to tackle them is to engage in an election with them, defeat their ideas head on, or adapt and change as needed to ensure that CCP rule is most dynamic to the interests of local groups. Because the alternatives under their side are always worse. Either those groups become dissident elements within the CCP, working to deliberately stabilise national Politburo policy to say the leadership of Xi Jinping is ineffective, or they push active revelatory or strikes and things like that. Because it's a lie to suggest that strikes aren't happening at the moment. There were hundreds of strikes in Hangzhou and Beijing and Shanghai within the last year, huge amounts of growing opposition to the economic policies. Analysis Emma gives you that side ignores and tries to assert isn't the case. They say at the moment that the policy of the government is very effective, but won't be effective when we have local elections. Unclear why. I'm going to talk about later on why actually we get more effective local policy, no thank you, that increases its ability to work. They say there are lots of upcoming conflicts, most particularly the reshuffle of the Politburo scheduled for late 2017. We say that's exactly the best time to force opposition movements out of the CCP when now they cannot gain claim to senior CCP positions, and now that you have to say the area where you now compete with us is in local mayoral races that effectively sets a cap on their political influence and very effectively limits their ability to be a dissident power. No, thank you. Finally, they say foreign powers will interfere. Their analysis rests on Russian interference in the US election. Consider that mayoral races are very disparate, that involvement around this would involve immense coordination and sets natural financial disincentives to foreign powers to do this. But if they're right and foreign powers do interfere, it's far more easy for them to do so when they can corrupt and buy off local CCP officials. Analysis that we tell you is why corruption is on the rise. For those reasons, that extension does not stand. No, thank you. But what does this do to those movements more broadly? We told you that what it does is controls what that resistance looks like, because we think there are two scenarios here. Opening opposition says, allowing these elections to occur where critique of policy will now sow seeds of doubt. Little analysis here. We say there are two scenarios. Either that critique is toothless, because factually the people are happy with that economic and social policy, in which case that critique doesn't resonate and doesn't sow any seeds of doubt, or it does, because the policies at the moment aren't working and aren't providing for those local people, which suggests that those policies are bad and will lead to instability anyway. We increase a feedback mechanism whereby the CCP can far more quickly adapt and change to meet those new conditions. Their side doesn't, because they're stuck under the yoke of the hierarchy and conservatism and slowness of a centralized CCP. The next thing we say is that if we can control these movements, because by their own analysis down the line, the CCP is deeply effective at things like controlling what information is available, deeply effective at things like censorship. That says that the cultural forces that operate in local mayoral races in Hangzhou are very different from what might operate in Sydney or Washington, and the sorts of concerns, given we know that CCP rule has been so historically premised on economic legitimacy, suggest that those will be the overriding factors, given that economic concerns are the leading cause, no thank you, of strikes. But what are the effects on resistance? Parts of our extension that they didn't want to deal with. We think they ultimately, no thank you, no thank you. I'll take someone in a moment. We think what this does is that it forces these resistant movements to compete on either economic or social measures, to which we, the CCP, have an enormous first mover advantage, which suggests that in many cases we'll be able to defeat them head on. Secondly, it relocalizes their grievances to local officials rather than senior party officials of the party more broadly, which sets a limit to the max destabilizatory power that those things can do. But given efficacy of local politics is contingent on negotiation with the Politburo, this was the crucial mechanism Emma gave you, moderation has to occur, because you can't be that anti-CCP if you want to do anything and deliver for your people. They will just shut you out, which suggests that the level of criticism under their side is far worse. I'll take opening.
To the moderate person your extension relies on, what is a more viable alternative for them resisting? One that risks total upheaval and something unlike anything they've ever known, tarred with brush of neo-imperialism, or one where there are leaders that have been in government before and have the support of the media?
No, the point is at the moment that as the CCP we're experiencing enormous numbers of backlash to things like corruption and the failure of many economic policies to deliver sufficiently. The question for this debate is by which mechanism can we best alleviate those concerns and secure CCP rule into the long run? What do these elections look like? Because the lack of clarity by this side is unclear. They say the CCP is enormously popular. They're very good at controlling information, and yet these will be highly destabilizing, which is why I asked my POI, why won't they just win all of them? I've already dealt with the idea that critique inherently leads to sowing doubt. They say again, and this is the push at CO, that we must reveal all information. Of course the local election will be about Tiananmen Square. Again, we don't think that's the case, given that mayoral elections are about localities rather than nationalities. But secondly, even if, right, this is after the fact of 35 years of government censorship, they're unlikely to believe the validity or legitimacy of that information, right? By your own analysis, they don't think it happened. The impact on government policy under our side is that it allows us to cater policy to where it's most needed and secure the interests of the CCP in the long run. For those reasons, vote closing government.
We all good?
I think that when the Chinese Communist Party concedes the principle that democracy is good and a necessity, you are likely to see an increased demand for democracy rather than a decrease. The top half debate looks like this. Opening government tell us there is some sort of need to democratise as a result of a pressure valve. Opening opposition tell us that there might be some risks of further instability as a result of doing so. I think Bethany wins this when she explains that regardless of whether or not it's true that the Chinese Communist Party might one day need to democratise, now is especially the wrong time to do so that will bring with it great instability. To be fair to them, extension do make broadly the same case. So with that in mind, I'm going to look, well, obviously the opposite side, now is a good time to do it. So with that in mind, I'm going to look at three things. First of all, the extension. Secondly, is it necessary to do this to prevent overthrow? Thirdly, will this help or harm the economy? So first of all, on the we've just heard. So, we get told in some that no, this will just be a competition about economic issues because they're local issues. Yeah, because no local politician would ever campaign on national issues. No, this is ridiculous. When you're in a dictatorship and the only ability you have to campaign is in these platforms, everyone with a grievance with the dictatorship will campaign on this platform. This is exactly how we saw Solidarity organised in Poland. This is exactly how we saw Aung San Suu Kyi's New Democracy movement in Burma organised on the same lines. Going into local issues and saying you shouldn't elect the Communist Party because you need to send a message to the government that this party is unreal. We then get told from some, no, because either it is the case that these movements are so powerful that we need to appease them by giving them something, or it's the case that they're so weak that the Chinese Communist Party would win any elections anyway, so there's no problem. But recognise, this ignores the fact that at the point at which you give them a platform to campaign on, these movements get stronger. So our contention is they aren't strong enough now to be a threat to the instability of the Chinese regime, but they will get stronger on their side of the house. This is for several reasons. First of all, you give leaders a chance to emerge insofar as a popular leader can stand on the platform of an election and get name recognition, get a personal following. Secondly, you give them the capability to organise. Because if the local party in Beijing decides to campaign on the basis of, hey, Tiananmen Square was bad, and maybe we need to protest against the government which did it, and maybe we need to arrest and we need to start arresting officials who did this, you can't then arrest them for doing so and still have it be a free and fair election. Also recognise this will give people information about what's happened. Because yes, it's true. At the moment, lots of Chinese people don't know Tiananmen Square happened. When someone stands on a platform and tells you Tiananmen Square happened, when they're distributing election material saying this happened, providing photographic evidence, we think it's plausible that a lot of Chinese people are likely to find out about this. So what's the comparative on our side of the house? How do we deal with these movements? Exactly the way the Chinese government is doing so under the status quo. Where there are democracy leaders, we disappear and murder them. Where there are protests, we massacre the strikers. Where there are problematic ethnicities, we move in thousands of Han Chinese to dominate the issue there. The Chinese Communist Party has been consistently doing this over the past 20 years. I see no reason why it couldn't continue to do so now, given that both sides have accepted this is about the interests of the Chinese Communist Party rather than morality. So, the claim from extension is that we need to do this now while we're still powerful. Okay, sure, but this assumes that we are going to be getting less powerful at some point in the future. And we don't actually get any analysis on this from then. If anything, it would be relying on the same analysis that Openinger give as to why we have something there. So I'll deal with it when we go into there. The main claim then is that we channel this into local areas and away from sort of disruptive national issues. So first of all, in terms of championing into local, where they would have to compete with the Chinese Communist Party on economic issues, and the CCP has the advantage there. But if it's true the CCP has such an advantage, why would any local politician try to compete with them on economic issues? You would pick the areas where you have a comparative advantage, which is anything that's not economic, which is social issues, which is Tibetan nationalism, which is seeking redress for the grievances that they've done. But I just think it's an incredibly odd characterisation they give us, because their characterisation seems to be, it will be good worker communists standing here to provide a challenge to the CCP and make the party better. But recognise, all of these people already do that through the mechanism of internal CCP elections. If you have a choice between standing against the CCP in an external election or in an internal election, if you just want the CCP to be better, you do so in the internal election where you're more likely to get a platform for that, rather than stand in the external one. So, will this channel them away from destructive means? I don't think so, because you'll use one to empower the other. For the reasons I've given as to how these movements grow, you're also able to specifically do this to do more destructive things. So you are, for example, having Uyghur nationalists standing on a platform of, we will specifically wreck the Han Chinese's attempts to extract resources from here. You have, for example, pro-democracy platformers standing on a platform of, we need to protest against this repressive government, and we'll do things like make their lives difficult, because they concede that these local politicians have an immense deal of power. So clearly, it is possible that if the movement gets more powerful, it is able to do things to disrupt them in this way. And also in the contention that we need to get them out of the CCCP and externally, because that might be better. One, we're not told why it's better, but two, we can just purge them on our side of the house. I don't see why this would be an issue. So, do we need to do this in order to prevent the overthrow? These are the reasons we get from opening government. So firstly, Tommy tells us that we can't block the internet. This is strange, given that one, the Chinese government is already doing this with the Great firewall of China, and it's difficult to breach past that. But two, they're setting up their own internal intranets. They're setting up their own internal intranets. They have, for example, Perfect World servers, which is like a sort of separate internet for Chinese youth and social networking, which isn't accessible externally, where they're much more able to control it. Also, they have immense resources and ability to police these networks. They hire lots of hackers who are able to look like this. Tommy tells us that the people who do this will only want to get rid of local politicians, and they'll use it to get rid of local corruption. But look, if corruption is such a problem, number one, we're much more able to remove corrupt politicians on our side of the house. On their side of the house, you might not be able to remove corrupt popular politicians, which could cause dissatisfaction. But secondly, we have a massive incentive to tackle this. Recognize Xi Jinping has been doing massive purges lately of the Chinese Communist Party in an attempt to get rid of corruption, because he knows precisely how destabilizing it is to them. In terms of, we'll be able to know what it is that's causing local anger, I have no idea why you can't just do opinion polling or ask people or get this through the means of the Chinese Communist Party. If anything, I'd like to ask people what is wrong and then decide whether or not it's in the national interest to solve that problem, rather than relying on NIMBYism, rather than relying on the fact people say, hey, we maybe don't want this dam that's going to be great for the economy of China, but we don't want our homes flooded, and then having to concede that. Opening.
You are a local person living on a few $100s a month. Do you think you'd prioritise voting for someone who will allocate resources more efficiently so your and your children's lives keep getting better, or throw away your vote protesting against Beijing by electing a local councillor who happens to be criticising them?
I think people care about freedom. I'm going to make the contention that when Chinese citizens went out to be shot and die in Tiananmen Square, when local activists continue to face ongoing repression, torture and disappearance and are willing to put up with this, I think they care about freedom. I don't think Chinese people are some sort of strange, otherworldly, Confucian values people who only care about their economy. I think they're human, like all other humans. They have the same desire for freedom. They have the same desire to see their rights respected. So, what are the claims we get from opening as to why this will help or harm the economy? So, they tell us that local officials are extremely powerful and need appeased. First of all, this is a concession that this could be a problem if lots of those local officials suddenly become your problem. But secondly, insofar as this is an issue, I don't see why we can't just replace them under the status quo. Like, there's an enormous collective action problem for these local officials where they can't band together to rebel against the Chinese Communist Party. They could on their side of the house when they're allowed to form their own party and stand in free and fair elections with that. They then tell us if an economic crisis hits. But recognise, I just think it's, first of all, unlikely that it's going to happen. But secondly, if an economic crisis is going to happen, it seems like liberalising in the middle of that when the Chinese Communist Party, when the national government, which always gets blamed for national economic crises, given they're the ones who have the sort of leaves in decision makings doing this, will be the ones held accountable. I'd much rather wait till after that was over if we were ever going to liberalise. I think now is the worst possible time to do this. For all these reasons, oppose.